So welcome everyone. This is a panel on regenerative tourism beyond sustainability. I have with me a really fascinating panel today. Bill Reed, who's the principal of Regenesis Group. They've been doing regenerative work for 25 years. Dr. Joel Hooper, who's the Chief Operating Officer and Head of Product for Jet Group, also regenerative practitioner specialists with a tech background as well. And also David Leventhall, who's the operations manager for Playa Viva, which is a really important case study in hospitality and the tourism sector that was built on regenerative principles. So we're bound to have a really interesting conversation. But I will let each person introduce themselves. Bill, would you like to go first?
Certainly. Thanks, Peta. I'm Bill Reed with Regenesis, and I like to say that I'm a recovering architect. I am an architect and planner, but practicing primarily in the larger systems world of how do we recover human relationships with the living systems that support us. So how do we participate in a co-evolutionary process? And we work with cities and ecosystems around the world doing so. Thanks.
Great. Joel?
Sure. Yeah, just before introducing myself, I'd just like to very acknowledge the voices who aren't present in this conversation. So the voices and wisdoms of Indigenous people of all cultures, all skin tones, all genders, and also just to invite the listener to consider this conversation as part of a bigger dialogue that includes all of those voices. I have a background in biology, psychology, art, business, technology, bit of sport in there as well. So I like to do all kinds of things, but at the moment I'm with Jet Group. We are focused on regenerative practice and regenerative transitions, and we're really focused on the whole city scale, and indeed it's emerging into whole country scale of regenerative transitions, that where we really build on the work of our partners, Bill and colleagues at Regenesis, and also bring a technology contribution to the major effort that's required to do transitions at that scale.
Great, thank you. And David?
Yeah, I just want to check to make sure you can hear me okay. My bandwidth suddenly got worse.
Yeah, we
Give me a thumbs up. Perfect. Well, I'm David Leventhall. I am, I like to say, the steward of, my official title is Operating Manager of Playa Viva, which is a regenerative boutique hotel located on 200 acres, about a mile of beachfront, just south of Zihuatanejo, Mexico. And it was developed in a regenerative way. Opened up in 2008. We're in season 14 now. Proud to say that we just got our B Corp certification and have the highest B Corp certification of any hotel in the world. So proud to be part of that community, and thanks for inviting me to join this conversation.
Great, thank you. Thanks for being here. I'm Peta Milan. I'm the principal founder of Henmil Group Family Office. I'm based in Dubai. We specialize in regenerative investing. I've developed a model on regenerative investment and what that actually looks like. I also sit on the International Advisory Board for the World Sustainable Development Forum. I'm also part of All Hands, which is a multidisciplinary, multi-stakeholder group working to counter radicalization and violent extremism around the world. I'm also a regenerative practitioner and very passionate about what this work can actually do to take us beyond sustainability, to really interrupt and mitigate some of these intractable global challenges that we face. Today, we're talking about it in the context of tourism. Many of you who've searched it online might find regeneration in reference to agriculture, particularly, but regeneration is more than agriculture. And I'm going to kick this off with a very important distinction. Bill, I'd like to ask you, what is regeneration and how is it actually different to sustainability? We hear people bandying the word about regeneration more and more in the ecosystem now. But deep diving into what it actually is and how do we know if something's regenerative or not, I think is an important question.
Yeah, it's a big question. I think it's ultimately simple, but we are so used to looking at green and sustainable design as fixing problems, whether it's reducing energy usage or carbon in the atmosphere or cleaning up water, and all that is really important stuff. From our perspective, though, that misses the larger issue of how we reframe our relationship with the living systems that support us. And so when we talk about sustainability, what we're really talking about, and I think generically, is how do we sustain life? Because it's life that supports us. And so working with making things more efficient and less bad, if you will, like I said, while important, it doesn't get us to over the mark. And so what is the mark? The mark is that we actually need to reframe our existence so that we're participating with life on its own terms. Coevolution, in other words. How do we learn to take care of the living systems that support us and live in a harmonious relationship with those systems? So the distinction that I want to make, though, is that restoration is the beginning of getting us there. But restoration is not the same thing as regeneration. Regeneration is the ability to do it over and over again, because life continually changes and evolves. So it's how do we participate in an ongoing evolutionary way with the processes of life? Hope that's not too much of a mouthful.
Yeah, so what I hear you saying in a nutshell is you're going a bit deeper and you're looking at what are the conditions that make life thrive, and how do we create those conditions so that life continues to thrive on its own terms. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Is there anything anyone else wants to add to that?
I'll add a little bit to it. I mean, we're constantly talking to what I'll call lay audience about what regeneration means. And I like to say, and Bill, correct me if I'm wrong here, that regeneration really is about a paradigm shift. It's a way of changing the way you're thinking. And some of those paradigm shifts come around the language that we use, because how we think is related to the words and the language we use to explain the world around us. And so part for me is this concept of whole systems thinking, not just thinking one lever is going to change things. Another one is really moving from an extractive model to moving to one of abundance, or from scarcity to abundance, I think is important to us. And Bill taught me something early on, which really is around understanding history of place and how a place got to be the way it is. And humans have touched it and degraded it in some form or fashion, to then understand your role as stewards in bringing back that abundance. So that's how I generally talk about it from the standpoint of hospitality and travel. I think the other word that I use a lot within hospitality and travel is reciprocity, especially from the standpoint of traveler and host, or guest and host, and that there really be a reciprocal relationship between those entities in a travel perspective.
Yeah, the paradigm shift point's really important, David. As I speak to people and they say they're doing regeneration, I ask them the question, well, what are you regenerating? And they're saying, well, we're building an ecosystem. But the building of an ecosystem itself is not enough, because in nature and living systems, we see a fundamental transformation happen. Inherent in the evolutionary nature of nature is a transformation. A chrysalis transforms into a butterfly. Matter changes form and becomes biodegradable mass. It's a transformation of some kind. So we can build more structures like ecosystems, but unless we're fundamentally transforming something, which you've referenced to as like a paradigm shift, then we know that we're building more structures, we're not necessarily being regenerative. So I think that paradigm shift point that you're making is really important. So Joel.
Well, Peter, I want to ask you, what do you mean by building an ecosystem?
Well, they're not my words. They're words that other people have spoken about. So they're building like an ecosystem that supports like young entrepreneurs or new businesses. So like a supply chain or
so it's a narrower
web of
domain.
Interconnected pieces, right? And so they think because it's an ecosystem, it's living systems, but they forget the transformation piece.
Well, they forget the whole system. The whole system is really important.
Yeah, the whole system is more than an ecosystem, right?
It includes everything you can imagine. It includes everything, and there are ways to address that, but it's beyond the typical reductionist mind says, well, we have to manage things with small problems, and that's actually what's destroying us. It's both wonderfully helpful, but it's also killing us.
Right. So I just want to ask, Joel, you've been a regenerative practitioner for a few years and you've got a background in technology and AI. Obviously, if we're talking about whole systems in the world Bill's talking about, we're talking about things that are complex, right? Because whole systems are highly complex systems. So what do you see is the role that technology can play in regeneration and building regenerative capabilities in humans?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think in the broader sense, the idea of technology is not just machines and software programs. That's the most common way that it's used today. But in the broader sense, technology can also mean things like systems thinking frameworks that people can use to see how their own thinking works and can consciously choose how we want to think. What is the source of our own thinking? So technology can be used broadly in that sense, to talk about things like thinking frameworks, ways of thinking, etc. But right now, the word technology is more commonly used for like machines and software programs, this kind of stuff, right? And I think in this sense, technology to me hasn't really helped much yet in terms of doing regenerative work, but I think it has the potential to contribute to really regenerative work. But I think only if we think very deliberately about how it's designed and what its role is. When we talk about technology as machines and software programs, we need to be aware that it's working on quite a different logic to living systems, right? It's often working on direct linear logics, like the kind that Bill was referring to earlier in terms of thinking about small solutions for one part of for one particular part of a problem. That's often really how the logic of machines and software programs works. So, but technology is designed through a series of decisions that are made by people, right? And those decisions can help users see some things more clearly. It can obscure and hide other things. It can invite people in to participate into an experience. It can also exclude other people from participating in an experience. And so that's really what makes technology what it is. It's those decisions that humans make when they're designing it, the things that they pay attention to and the things that they don't pay attention to get codified into the technology. And so what Bill and David were talking about earlier in terms of a key aspect being the way we think about things, this is certainly absolutely the case in how we use technology. So at JET, we're working with software in this deliberately conscious way that's informed by regenerative frameworks. We use regenerative frameworks to help us see our own thinking when we're designing software and technology and thinking about its role in regenerative work. So if we take one product that we're working on, Communityverse, and then if we take that in the context of regenerative tourism, which we're talking about here, we can think about the tourist experience as there being before someone travels somewhere, while someone is traveling somewhere, and after someone has traveled somewhere. And we can think about, as David was saying, the same in a reciprocal way of the place. Before a visitor comes into the place, while a visitor is in that place, and after the visitor has been in that place. And we can think about at each of those stages for both participants in that reciprocal interaction, how can we invite them into a developmental experience at each one of those stages, and a developmental experience that is developmental for them, it's developmental for the place that they're visiting, and then it's developmental for their home place when they move back and return to their home place. And really importantly, developmental in such a way that the developmental experience is sourced in the place where it's happening, right? So it's not about the tourist or the visitor coming in and contributing something from their own way of thinking that has nothing to do with the place that they're visiting. You know, this developmental experience has to help them see you know, what makes this place what it is, and how that can be the basis for their contribution to the evolution of that place.
Yeah, it's an amazing point. And on that, I'd like to refer to David, because I think you've done an amazing job of that in Playa Viva, in terms of really working with the place source potential of that place to come up with the design thinking around how Playa Viva can be expressed in the world and how it's deeply interconnected with the local community. Maybe you can share from your perspective, in having been working on Playa Viva, you know, what had you choose to approach that project regeneratively, and what did you see through its evolution?
Well, probably the best way to talk about that is to give an example or two of what Joel just mentioned. One of them is there's a turtle sanctuary on site in which they're working to protect marine turtles from poachers and predators. And it's part of the guest experience to walk down the beach at dawn to go to the turtle sanctuary to release baby turtles. And I've done it now for 16 years. It's like, oh God, releasing baby turtles. But I forget, and the locals forget, that what one woman just told me just yesterday, which is it's a life-changing experience for her to go down there and see these baby turtles be released and know exactly where to go and go to the ocean. And she used those words. This is a life-changing experience. And the reciprocity, Joel, goes back to how does the Turtle Sanctuary volunteer, who is one of 14 volunteers who usually the poorest in the community, who used to be poachers, who've now been converted to being saving, doing the opposite, are watching the reaction of a person to something for them which has become so everyday. And they realize what is special about what they're doing. And that reciprocity has immense benefits for the entire ecosystem, for the place, the people, however you want to call it. That's one example. I mean, the same thing I can use in a new excursion that we're doing, which is called Fishing with Johnny. People are like, you should not call it Fishing with Johnny. You should call it an immersive marine biology experience with the locals, because it's, you know, one guy gets the fishing rods, another gets the boat, another gets the cooler. Next thing you know, you're past the wave break. You're out there line fishing. You're catching a bonito. Another guy's like making sashimi on the boat, just like they would do, or ceviche. And another guy's diving in, coming up with oysters. You're eating fresh oysters there. You're seeing turtles and dolphins and whales breaching. You get into the water, you hear the whales saying, you know, like, fishing tour? Like, no. And then part of that transformational experience there, and part of the kind of reciprocity is, again, here's fishermen who are earning more through tourism in one day than they would earn 1 week fishing. They don't have to extract as much fish from the water, just enough for them to eat on their own, not to sell to have a living. They also have had that experience of, wow, what is to us a job and dredge, have to go down and get this stuff every time, is now somebody else's joy that they get to share with them. I mean, that, and that's evolved over time. This is a brand new excursion that we're doing now. So, you know, that's the nature of what we do. And a lot of it's really focusing on exactly what Joel and Bill said, which is honoring place and engaging people on a one-to-one basis to what the folks are doing there. And that creates no space.
Yeah. So Bill, one thing that I think is important is, you know, it's really easy to get kind of awe-inspired by listening to like the real stories, you know, that David shares about Playa Viva and the magic they create in those communities. But when you and I are working with governments at that kind of level or at the investor level, it can get a little bit tricky because investors and governments still think there's a trade-off between returns and impact. They don't see, there's this assumption in the world that you have to sacrifice returns in order to have impact. And I mean, you've worked on Playa Viva with David. You've seen some of the miracles that have occurred by the creation of the application of the regenerative frameworks into this particular place and the uniqueness that's being expressed. So, what are your thoughts on how we reconcile this kind of like dyadic, almost a bit of a fallacy, but these like contrasting belief systems in order to open up new possibilities with governments and investors?
Well, that's a subject that's occupied my mind for probably 25 years. The story that David just told is the most compelling way to shift anybody's consciousness, right? You don't even think about money after that. You just think, this is life. This is really cool. I want that. Nonetheless, at some point, you typically have to talk about money. And Danella Meadows, in her famous article, Places to Intervene in a System, talks about money and numbers as leverage points in the system. And out of the 12 that she lists, it's the least effective. It's number 12 or number 1 in her case, where it doesn't change much. And I've never convinced anybody to change their paradigm, if you will, by talking about saving money. However, if you don't talk about it, you're not going to even get an audience with some of those folks. So it's important to mention that I've never worked on a project that cost the client more than they expected. In fact, typically much less. Typically savings of an average of 18 months on some of the projects that we've actually tracked, up to even 10 years. And first costs, just tracking LEED as a standard metric, we build LEED platinum buildings at about 2% less than conventional construction cost. How can you get more and pay less? That's the big question that they can't imagine that, but it's because we are working in a different way. To do different things, you have to do things differently. And so the integrative process is one where we are actually co-creating and allowing everyone to express in a very organized fashion, to give people the freedom to express what's in their heart more than just what's on the table. And that too, of course, the data as well. And that opportunity to allow working with an emerging understanding and emerging creativity from all the players allows for an incredibly efficient and effective design process. So we say, you know that term, that quick little analogy, faster, better, cheaper, pick 2, because you only get 2. But with this work, you actually get all 3, faster, better, cheaper.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'll stop there.
I read an interesting quote before the panel today, but I can't remember, unfortunately, who the quote was from, but it said that leadership focuses 5% of its attention on the problem and 95% of its attention on the solution. And I thought that this was really relevant to the panel because, as Joel was saying, with respect to technology and also building new industries like tourism and different types of things, we're very quick to jump into solution making without really understanding what it is that we're working with. Yeah. And I think that is where that regeneration really flips it on its head. It gives us a much deeper grounded understanding of what it is that we're working with, and then the solutions are expressed from that understanding.
Yeah.
Can I add a little something to what Bill said?
Yeah.
I think key terms for me is, extraction versus abundance and the abundance. And I think one is a short-term strategy versus a long-term strategy. And the other one is resilience. So I was recently at a conference on sustainable regenerative development in Cabo, which a gentleman was speaking from Harvard, and he was showing models on on tourism that built up really quickly, but over time began to lose revenue, whereas tourism that built up slowly had more longer term and lasting value for those communities. One is resilience. When we look at investments in a regenerative system, The example would be the recent hurricane that hit Fort Myers, where it completely devastated most of the communities around there. But there was this community, I forget the name of it, and they had built 100% off-grid solar, put swell ponds in for water surges, had built to a standard of a 5 category hurricane, and they had 0 damage at the end. So it was more, investment up front over the long term, but yet they didn't have to go back and rebuild and the cost of rebuilding.
Yeah.
So I think those are key terms for me when looking at, what are you trading off is short-term versus long-term and resiliency.
Yeah.
Can I add a little more, Peta?
Yeah, go on.
So Rob Watson, a friend of mine, one of the founder of basically the father of LEED, if you will. He and I were talking a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about cost of green buildings and how they come in less expensive. How does that happen? And what Rob said, I really liked. He said, green buildings don't cost less, they cost different. Meaning that you apply your thinking to different places that matter. And this idea of the story that David told about the turtle sanctuary, that matters, right? And that matters to people. And we want, and we have a fund that we're trying to fund for regenerative development. And we don't want investors that are only talking about money. We certainly want to talk about money, but that's not what we should be leading with. That's not the important stuff. Money's easy to make, but actually the stuff that we're trying to obtain or attain by doing this work is more important. So we want investors that care. And with the clients, Peta, that you and I have been talking with, I worry that they don't care.
Yeah,
So
I mean, let's put it into context, guys. You've got like a politician who's been elected and is in there for a term of like 4, maybe 5 years. And so you're talking long term, people freak out. They think, oh, we're not going to recognize benefit for like 10 or 15 years, because that's what their mind does when they think long term. But there's not actually that much of a trade-off between long term and short term, because when you're working regeneratively, you are getting these quick wins. You are getting these results in the short to mid-term that fits within a political cycle, as well as, because they've got, especially when you're talking about governments that have a huge amount of their GDP based on tourism, like Indonesia, for instance. So those types of countries need to be thinking economically. They need to be thinking in terms of financial returns, at least in terms of how they're framing the industry right now. But what we're saying is that you don't need to lead with that, because even though it's important, because you're talking about the livelihood of many people in your country, you get far more than that richness when you're applying things regeneratively.
Yeah, and it's short term. I'm going to pick up, David did not starve himself for 15 years. I mean, he had to actually hit the ground running. It's not that this, well, maybe David, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's not that this work takes away from profitability at all.
No.
Dave, come back and correct me on that.
Well, I'm just thinking about 2 things related to what you're saying, Peter, which is, sure, politicians can think short term, but there are politicians right now that are seeing the after effects of the decisions they made to deregulate the banking system. Okay, it's coming back to roost with them. And, there are many other examples like that. I was talking to somebody from Troy, Michigan about, the lead pipes. They were like, that was a short-term decision by politicians to stop using a chemical that lined the pipes. That's all it was. That decision came back to hit those politicians, and it cost them much more in the long run. So yeah, you can build cheap and sell high, but over the long term, it's going to be a lot more expensive to operate.
Cycle again. Yeah.
Right, to operate those buildings. And now I'm getting calls from other developers going, hey, we need your help. How did you create community? How did you do this? Because they're seeing our continued success, where that initial, hey, we sold out high, it's like, ooh, ouch, ooh, it hurts.
Yeah, and that happened particularly in COVID, right? Where we saw, particularly in tourism, got really crushed as an industry in many parts of the world. It didn't have that fundamental resilience.
Glamping sites and outdoor sites that brought you into the outdoors were operating at 95, 100% occupancy.
During
Hmm.
COVID.
Yes,
Wow, that's amazing.
yes.
Yeah. So Joel, let's take it from like a specific place, a concrete place, and let's talk about it in the context of cities. You mentioned Jet Group doing it in terms of whole cities. You're talking much larger populations. You're talking hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people. And, you know, the different industries that get created and expressed through those transitions, including tourism. So what do you think, you know, in terms of governance? And we're talking about that. We've been, you know, talking about that with respect to short-term decision-making of policymakers. Governance is a big issue. And I know, Bill, you've experienced the governance challenges too in your regenerative work from decision makers. But what do you think, Joel, is, you know, how can governance work? And how can it impact on building industries such as tourism when it's approached from a regenerative perspective versus conventional ideas of kind of government and governance, thinking about things in terms of silos, like let's just think about tourism, or let's just think about agriculture, or let's just think about transport?
Yeah, well, I think there's an interesting. I'll get more onto the larger scale part, but I think there's a really interesting individual aspect to this, which is a sort of an emotional aspect. You know, I think people often in their jobs, people often sort of behave as if they don't care about, you know, broader life. But interestingly, in their personal lives, they often do things that show that they do care, you know, but they've been, you know, we've been trained in our professional lives to do things a certain way. And without going into that in too much detail, it's kind of scary for a lot of leaders, politicians, to sort of step into the possibility of a new way of doing things when they have never done that before.
I'd add investors into that little spectrum.
Investors as well. Yeah, absolutely. No matter, you know, whether they, you know, in their personal lives actually do care about life and have personal important experiences of themselves, you know, as children themselves, or with their children now, or in whatever, as individuals, of caring about other living beings, right? So I think that there's a big fear of failure, and a big emotional component of allowing oneself to step into a way of doing things that they haven't done before, with it, fear of judgment, fear of failure, and all of that kind of stuff. And so the reason I say that in the context of doing regeneration in large scales is because it really takes someone in, be it the mayor of a city, the governor of a city, someone in the mayor's or governor's office, a minister at the national level, to be really brave and really bring their own will and rally the will of those around them to have that group of people being willing to step into investing wholeheartedly in a new way of doing things. And I think that's really important, that that it's going to take people with that level of courage and that level of will to stand up and champion the work taking place in the places in which they are living and working, and where they have responsibilities. Then I think that opens up a whole load of potential when that happens, because people in the community, I think they are crying out for this kind of experience of directly participating in the direction that their places are going in. You know, they have enough experience of being sort of feeling disenfranchised or feeling left out of decision-making processes, or not having a voice of the things that are happening in their cities and their places, that when that they're invited into a process, I think immediately we see a huge surge of energy, where that energy of the potential of contributing, of participating, has been sort of, they've been holding that for so long, you know, and then they're like, wow, now I'm being invited to participate in something. I've got a whole lot of, I've got somewhere to really direct all of this energy that I've been holding on to for so long. So that's really the start of it, and that's, you know, a process of working with people who live in, primarily with people who live in a place, in the city, working as a community to build a shared understanding of what makes this place special and what makes this place different from any other place. And that's a process that's been pioneered by, you know, Bill and your colleagues at Regenesis, Story of Place. That's the basis of the work. And then from there, when that shared understanding is built, the community, or the, you know, organized into design teams, can then create and design a bunch of initiatives in arenas of work all across the city, together with experts and together with practitioners in different fields, you know, be it in the built environment, be it in infrastructure, industry, tourism, etc. And so in this way of doing things, tourism itself becomes just one arena that gets worked on in the context of the whole city. So it belongs to the city, and it is done in such a way that it's you know, it considers the impact on cultural heritage, it considers the impact on society, on ecology and economy, all at the same time. And it becomes, you know, in the case of tourism, you know, a form of tourism can emerge that's not imported from somewhere else. It's unique to this place, this city, and can't be found anywhere else, and that makes it really special.
Yeah. And I just, before you, Bill, I just want to add, you know, it's interesting because you do have this technology background. What I was hearing you say, Joel, this like will in stepping into working in a different way. For me, that's really what the heart of innovation is. Innovation is not like a thing to do. Like we talk about innovation in terms of technology. It's like another app to build. That's not innovation. You know, doing the same thing over and over, just in a different skin, is not innovation. It's like really bringing oneself to the table in a way that's daring to really try something new, invest in something new, see things anew, and engage differently than conventional ways of doing things. And that to me is like, it's really interesting that you raised that, because I thought of innovation as you were describing that. Sorry, Bill, what were you going to say?
I actually forgot what I was going to say, but I have another. So Joel said something about, I was never thought of it this way. He said, will opens up a whole load of potential. I think that's what you said. And we started the other way. I like it because it's both, right? But potential also opens up a whole load of will. And so wherever you find that will or potential, that's what gets you across the starting line anyway, and it actually keeps you going. I'm sure I'll remember what I was going to say.
Yeah. So let's bring this like great thinking into a concrete context. David, when you're working on Playa Viva, what were some of the biggest challenges that you faced, but also some of the big successes? Because you really were very brave in terms of your will, as Joel said, to open up to a new way of seeing this place. You could have come in as a very traditional developer, done things a particular way that's conventionally done your designs, kind of imported them into the place, but you chose not to approach it that way. You chose to really engage with the understanding the place powerfully first. And so you had that will, you had that creative will around understanding. So what were some of the biggest challenges and successes you experienced in that journey?
Well, I mean, the one that you just mentioned was what I refer to as trust the process, where, you know, the traditional process is, you know, design first. Here it's understand place and the design will emerge from it. But, you know, I don't know if Bill remembers, but, you know, we were originally going to be building, well, we built model homes and opened up Playa Viva in November of 2008. And if you guys, remember from our history lesson, 2008 was the global
The
economic
financial
collapse,
crisis.
primarily because of the housing crisis. So people could barely hold on to their first house, much less buy a vacation home. Not only that, but Mexico was in the midst of a pandemic. It got hit by swine flu, H1N1, influenza, and drug wars were at its height. So when we opened was this, triple perfect storm of challenges that hit us. We could only look at it and say, well, I guess it can only get better from here. But I think part of that really allowed us to pivot, which I think good business people do and resilient systems do, which is we took our model homes and turned them into boutique hotel. Because of the influenza, Julia Garcia, who is our general manager, who's from Huachuca, had left to go work in restaurants at Club Med as a busgirl and worked her way up to head of F&B, was let go by Club Med because of the influenza and walked in our door the day we opened. So that was, a challenge for her that became an opportunity. And so, the other one I think is listening to the place and really understanding what it needed to evolve into what it's become. So, that I think has been a challenge for us, but at the same time has allowed us to really create something award-winning and unique, and has allowed us to develop something that drives a lot of tourism our way, but the kind of tourism that we want. I would say the biggest challenge, and this came up when we do presentations to big groups, and it was mentioned by somebody who works in our farm team. I asked her, what's the biggest challenge? And she said, changing people's habits. People get into the same way of doing things. And one of the core principles that came out of our original work with Bill and Regenesis in our 5 core values is creating transformational experiences. And it's what I now refer to as a triple ripple, in this sense of, the stories I like to tell about the biggest wins that came off those challenges is somebody who worked on our farm teams like, what is this permaculture stuff and why should I do it? And then going back to their home and their farm and visiting them, and they're now not using pesticides. They're using the techniques that they learned through permaculture working at Playa Viva. And now they're inviting their neighbors in and saying, hey, check this out. Look at what I'm doing. Look how I'm making my own fertilizers. And so we're affecting people through that triple ripple and changing people's habits about how they do things. So, I could keep going on and on and on about examples like that, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, it's amazing. Thank you. So Bill, you recently wrote, you co-authored a report, like a national tourism strategy report for the Canadian government. So in your experience, can you describe like the developmental nature of regenerative work and what governments need to consider if they're interested in exploring a regenerative tourism strategy? And how do you reconcile the conventional approach to tourism with a regenerative approach, which is very different? So that, maybe you can share that through a real example, that's something other than Playa Viva that you've experienced, or just share that, because it is a more of a long-term commitment, as both David and Joel have shared, and it is developmental. So maybe you can unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, I could share a story, one that I'm not intimately familiar with, but that was brought up to my attention by Michelle Holliday, my co-author on this. Playa Viva's in this as well. I want to give credit to Destination Canada for wanting to pursue this. This is not our idea. They invited us because of our experience in this work. And what they are is a destination management organization, and they are committed to not just work on heads on beds, right? This is, this kind of, which is a way to destroy the very thing that you are experiencing. And so how do you balance that? And how do you find resources in a community that care about the community, not just selling, an economic posture from tourism and the benefits of tourism? So the idea here is that, let's see if I can give reference to this Ella, because I really like his work. This is a scrolling through here. I'm not finding it, but let me just share the story. Is that but let me to answer the question about the government role. The government role is here to help support communities in destination management, and I think that's a good term. Managing your destination so that it's not destroyed through the golden goose, if you will, the goose that laid the golden egg. And the wonderful thing about tourism is that it gives leadership a long-term presence in the community, because this work is a practice. It isn't an event. You don't have a conference and say be regenerative and all of a sudden everybody's going to practice this. It takes time to practice anything worthwhile. And it's funny that we've been talking about this work in sustainability for 40 years now, and it's always done through conferences or reports. Those are the least effective way to get anything done. And if you're going to learn an instrument or a language, you've got to practice. So what destination management organizations are to help support a practice. And this one example is really cool. It was a woodworker who had his grandfather's tools, and I'm sorry, David is his first name if I butchering the story a little bit, but he wanted to share his love of woodworking. He's also a forester and loved the forest. He would go and harvest dead wood or struggling trees. And somebody pointed out to him, a consultant actually said, this is a great story and you can live your story. And so what he started to do is to take people on tours of the forest and how he lumbered and brought people back. And then they made charcuterie boards. So that's what he offers, is they're beautiful boards from this wonderful wood. And they have and then they celebrate their completion of their boards by having a feast from local foods. So the farmers are participating too. So this one acupuncture point of a woodworker has just created this cascading benefit to forestry, to farming, to giving tourists a really good, feel-good experience. And he's part of a network of people in the community that are then honoring this community that they live in, holding true to what this community represents, not just selling more tchotchke, but actually selling, if you will, an authentic experience.
Yeah. So how can it look as like, can we dig a little bit more deeper into what the developmental practice then looks like? Because you pointed to it, but in real terms, what does it mean for governments that are looking to develop a regenerative tourism strategy and the types of developmental practices, they could expect through something like this?
Yeah, well, I'll summarize a 40-page report in 5 principles.
Do it.
So the first one is you got to understand and work at the scale of place. No, not bigger, not the region. We save the world through saving our places, if you will, if you're concerned about sustainability. Then you need to think about your place as a living ecosystem, not just dirt or a place that has hotels on it, but as an alive being. And then in order to support that, we cultivate a field of relationships, because it's everybody working together, not in silos, but how do we actually inform one another and learn from one another? And then once you cultivate that field of relationships, you can tap into the unique gifts and contributions of those individuals and do just what I just shared with you. How do you actually magnify that which you're already loving and good at, right? And of course, this is not linear. This is all done kind of concurrently. And then through that process, you're practicing stewardship and co-creation. And the end game is you're learning to celebrate, adapt, and deepen your relationship with life. So that's the summary of the document.
Bill,
thank you for the
quick question. Where does reciprocity fit into that model? Because that's a really good model. I like that.
The whole thing is about reciprocity. And because especially when you start understanding your place as a living ecosystem, that's the beginning of a reciprocal relationship. Then, and of course, it's just not us trying to emphasize humans to nature, it's human to human. So how do you cultivate a field of relationships to actually collaboratively learn from each other? And then you're inviting gifts. That's reciprocal right there. So you can see there's reciprocity throughout the whole thing. And then practice stewardship and co-creation. That's reciprocal.
Yeah. So if we can extend on that reciprocity theme, Joel, Jat's in discussions with a number of nation state leaders to look at developing national regenerative strategies. And I know Bill is also with Regenesis. So how do you see the complexities between the elements that you pointed out before in your last comment around economics, ecology, society, and culture heritage? How do you see they get powerfully integrated through a regenerative process and an approach towards regenerative tourism?
Well, in themselves, they're already expressions of the same thing. So they don't actually need to be integrated in and of themselves. They're
but they're often treated separately from a governance perspective as silos,
that's the thing, right? So they're already all expressions of the same thing. So they're all deeply connected and all shaping one another. So it's really, I think it's really the kind of Anglo-European tradition and the sort of way that sort of shaped kind of global patterns of how development is thought about and done, which separates these into distinct concepts and ideas, right? And where society as it is now becomes separated from cultural heritage, and that becomes separated from economy is separated from those two things. And so an economy is built and developed in a way that sort of gets like further and further away from society's needs and its cultural heritage. And then, ecology, has been seen as something also completely separate, which is indicated in the way that we talk about, we talk about ourselves, society, and then we talk about nature as something else, right? Nature's all the other stuff that's not human society, human culture. So it's the way we talk about it and think about it that separates things that are intrinsically deeply connected. So the way we think about nature turns nature into a resource for society, right? It's connected, but the way we think about it creates a certain pattern of connection, which ends up having one be subservient to the other, right? So if we look at it that way, we can see that it's connected, because the way we think about one shapes what happens to the other. So I think that to me is the biggest challenge, is that the way we are thinking about these aspects of our world is separating of them, and it has us work on things in such a way where we are the ones who build these trade-offs into these things, or the necessity of trade-offs into these things, and then we think it's the things themselves that inherently require us to make trade-offs between them. But that's not the case. It's the way we're thinking about it is actually introducing trade-offs where there don't need to be any, right? But we've if we're 45 years old, we've had 45 years of conditioning in thinking that way, and if we're 60 years old, we've had 60 years of conditioning in thinking in that way. So it's very hard to see, for a lot of us, it's very hard to see how why we think the way that we do and why things work the way that they do. And I think that's the hardest thing, is actually having people who have spent so long thinking a certain way, again, like, be brave enough to step into seeing things differently from that and using that as a basis to work on it differently. I think people are capable of doing that. People can do amazing things when we are able to feel our fears, but don't let those fears be the things that like determine how we engage with stuff. If we can have the fear and feel the fear and still engage, be brave enough to engage in an open enough way, then we can do amazing things together. But it's the habits, it's the fears, and it's not realizing that it's the way we're thinking about things that are keeping them all separate and keeping them all in tension with one another.
And I had a conversation, just to build on that, with a federal leader for tourism in one of the Southeast Asian countries not that long ago. And it was a second conversation, and I expected him and his core team to show up for the second conversation, but he'd already heard something different about the way regeneration works. And he'd invited ministers from 3 other ministries to join. We ended up having 21 people in the call. It was a totally different way of working compared to the very siloed, like ministry focused approach of how government works and develops policy and industry. And so that, I mean, Bill, I mean, you've worked on projects where you've had design teams of up to 200 people, right? From across different disciplines, departments, you know, expertises and community members as well. So it is very much a different way of working in which you're kind of like shifting the siloization of thought. So that's a great point, Joel. David, so what, based on, we're getting close to time. So I just want to end in, you know, what benefits do you see based on, you know, your years and years of practical experience now in Playa Viva, regeneration delivering to tourism and those that are investing in the industry, whether it be from a government level or an investor level or someone who wants to set up, you know, a boutique hotel like you have, or, you know, different elements, a tour operator, in terms of what are the benefits you see regeneration delivering to tourism that's not offered in conventional models?
Well, I'd like to think that the type of tourism that we build is the tourism of the future. It's what people want. That they are, you know, the commoditization of certain experiences leaves people looking for something unique. And when you do honor place, every place has that unique potential that comes out of it. And I think that people are looking for that now. They're looking for experiences. So that for, you know, any organization is to highlight what is special about their place without it becoming extractive, over touristic. And I think during COVID, many places that were over touristic saw what life could be like without it. And many who are seeing their developments going in that direction don't want it to go in that direction. And so by focusing in on this, I think the trade-off is one of quality over quantity, which can drive more in the long run for each and every one of those places. Hopefully that was succinct enough and addressed your question.
And I think also from the buyer's perspective, often we're willing to pay more for unique quality experiences than a mass market experience, right? So even in terms of, you know, like the economic drivers, you're building something rare and unique that then obviously will foster quite a bit of demand for that type of experience. So it's sometimes when people hear like quality versus quantity, it triggers their fear of loss. It might mean like less people, you know, less contribution to our tourism industry, less, you know, but it's not actually how I've also seen it working regeneratively. You're creating these powerful, unique experiences that are based on place-based potential that don't exist in other places in the world, and that fosters for itself its own energy, its own demand, and its own, you know, flow of interest and people to those locations. Well, I thank you so much, guys, and I really thank you for your time and the incredible work each of you are contributing to regeneration in the tourism sector. And I hope that our audience has gotten some value. And if you want to check out Playa Viva, you can check it out on the website. Breathtakingly beautiful place. And I strongly recommend you give it a visit if you want an experience of a regenerative destination. And, you know, if you want to learn how to build out your regenerative tourism strategy, whether it be locally or at a national level, you can contact Bill Reed at Regenesis or Joel Hooper at Jet Group. They collaborate, they're partners. We're doing a lot of great work. Yes, David.
One last little shout out to regenerativetravel.com as well.
Okay, regenerativetravel.com. Is that how you access Playa Viva, David, or